The whistling pines. It begins with silence. That kind of deep, unnatural silence that only exists in the most remote corners of the world, where not even birds dare sing. It was in such a place, buried deep within the eldritch forest, that Jack Ralston disappeared. A seasoned survivalist, an outdoor purist, and someone who prided himself on knowing every sound, every scent, and every rhythm of the wild. Jack thought the forest held no secrets from him. He was wrong. For years, Jack ran a modest but loyal YouTube channel where he documented solo survival trips. He wasn't flashy. No clickbait. Just practical advice and raw footage from real adventures. His fans respected his authenticity, his calm demeanor, and his deep reverence for nature. When he announced a 7-day excursion into the Eldridge Forest, a stretch of dense, seldom-traveled woodland in northern Washington, no one thought twice. Eldridge wasn't famous, but it had a reputation, a strange one. Locals spoke about the forest like it was alive, not metaphorically, literally. They said it moved when you weren't looking, that paths vanished and reappeared, that it echoed with sounds that didn't belong to any animal. Jack, ever the rationalist, dismissed the stories as folklore, campfire fuel. He even joked about it in his first video log before setting off into the trees. Day 1 was standard. Jack hiked 5 miles into the forest and set up camp near a shallow stream. His video showed him purifying water, carving stakes, talking about fire-starting techniques. Nothing strange. The only oddity was the quiet. He even commented on it, noting how few animals seemed active for October. Day 2, he woke to find small pine cones arranged in a circle outside his tent. He chalked it up to a prank. Maybe another camper, though he hadn't seen or heard anyone. He recorded a brief video that morning, laughing it off. But his tone had changed slightly, like he was trying to convince himself it was funny. That night, the sound came. At first, it was faint, just a gentle whistle, low and rhythmic, echoing between the trees. Jack assumed it was a wind, but when he stepped outside, the air was perfectly still. The whistling stopped. The forest stared back at him in perfect silence. He went back inside his tent. Didn't sleep. Day 3. Jack's morning vlog was shorter, less instructional, more uncertain. He talked about hearing someone walking around his camp after midnight. Twig snapping. Heavy breathing. He shouted but got no reply. No tracks. No signs. Just more pine cones. This time, they were stacked in little piles, 7 of them. He didn't laugh it off anymore. Instead, he muttered something under his breath before cutting the camera. He installed a trail cam that night, one of those infrared motion detectors, facing the edge of the clearing where he heard the sounds. His fire burned higher than usual. He slept with his knife close. What happened next was never broadcast on his channel, but fragments of the footage, leaked by someone who claimed to work with local authorities, painted a different picture. At 12:37 a.m., the camera picked up movement. Not footsteps, not branches swaying, but a shadow, tall, thin, unnaturally elongated. It moved without sound, without weight, and with it came the whistling. Louder now, still tuneful, still deliberate, but wrong. It didn't sound human anymore. It sounded like something trying to sound human. Jack appeared on camera, flashlight trembling in one hand, his blade in the other. He circled the camp, shouting into the trees. His voice cracked. He wasn't playing survivalist anymore. He was afraid, really afraid. Then nothing, a burst of static. The image cut out. When rescuers finally found his camp 5 days later, they were baffled. The tent was intact, supplies untouched, fire pit freshly used. But Jack was gone. No blood, no signs of struggle, just the camera, still recording, still pointed at the same edge of the forest. In the final frame, just before the battery died, a figure appears, faint, shrouded in darkness, watching. The pine cones were arranged in a new pattern that morning, an arrow pointing directly toward the deeper woods. Jack's disappearance made local news briefly. Some called it an accident, said he wandered off, got lost, succumbed to exposure. But those who'd followed his channel, those who'd watched the raw footage, knew better. They spoke of the whistle, of the strange arrangement of objects, of the figure that never fully appeared. One viewer enhanced the audio of Jack's final clip. Buried beneath the whistle, layered deep within the frequencies, was something else. A voice, whispering, only one word. Closer. The forest was searched again. Drones, dogs, teams of rangers. But nothing new was ever found. Just trees, pine needles, and silence. To this day, no one camps in Eldridge. Not after dark. Not anymore. The cabin that burned without fire. For years, there had been whispers about an old trapper's cabin deep in the Ash Grove forest, a place that didn't appear on any modern maps and couldn't be found by compass alone. Locals said it had burned down sometime in the 1970s, but there was no official record of the blaze. No fire department call, no mention in any newspaper archives. Just stories, rumors, of hikers who stumbled across the ruins and felt like they were being watched, of the smell of smoke in the air even when the forest was drenched in rain, of blackened walls that were still warm to the touch decades after the fire supposedly consumed them. Samira Patel didn't believe in ghost stories. She was a freelance journalist who specialized in debunking urban legends, especially the kinds that took root in isolated communities. After her last piece on haunted mining tunnels went viral, she decided to tackle the Ash Grove forest next. She was determined to find the remains of the cabin and prove once and for all that it was just a forgotten structure destroyed by time and weather, not by supernatural forces. She arrived in town with gear, a drone, and a healthy dose of skepticism. Most of the locals were tight-lipped, especially the older ones. They warned her not to go too far past the ridge trails. When she pressed them for why, they just shook their heads and told her it wasn't the forest that was dangerous. It was what was left behind inside it. Still, she managed to get some guidance from a retired forest ranger who, after a few drinks, sketched out a rough path to the location based on memory. He made her promise she wouldn't stay overnight. She broke that promise. The hike into Ash Grove was thick with vines and overgrowth. No real trails existed anymore, just game paths and hollowed-out deer runs. For the first few hours, everything was uneventful. Samira filmed her progress, offering commentary about how fear and folklore often took root where there was historical trauma. Fires, disappearances, failed settlements. But as she got deeper into the forest, things began to change. The air grew colder, despite the season. The wind no longer rustled the trees, and a dense, unnatural fog began to creep between the trunks like it had a will of its own. That's when she found it. The cabin's remains stood like a skeleton on scorched earth. The beams were charred black, brittle, yet standing. A stone fireplace rose intact at one end, its soot-stained chimney stretching toward the canopy above. Samira was ecstatic. She documented everything, took measurements, samples, even used thermal imaging to debunk the myths about lingering heat. But her device glitched. It kept showing hot spots where there were none. The stone of the hearth, supposedly untouched for decades, registered over 130 degrees. Still, she stayed. She set up her tent a few yards from the ruins and prepared for a night of recording. Around midnight, her camera picked up something unusual, a flicker, a brief pulse of light in the center of the cabin. She dismissed it as a reflection or lens flare. But then it happened again, stronger, like the dying glow of embers reigniting. She stepped outside, flashlight in hand, and aimed it toward the cabin. The interior glowed orange, as if lit from within by a fire she couldn't see. She moved closer. The temperature rose with every step. Her skin prickled. The smell of smoke curled around her nostrils, thick and acrid. But when she reached the threshold, there was nothing. No flames. Just that glow, flickering like something alive behind the blackened walls. Her flashlight stuttered, then died. That's when she heard the voices. At first, just whispers. Then louder, echoing, angry, pleading, layered one over the other. Voices of men and women shouting things she couldn't understand, except one word. Over and over. Burn. She backed away, heart racing. But the forest behind her had changed. The trees looked twisted, warped. Her tent was gone. Her gear, her bag, vanished. And the cabin behind her was no longer a ruin. It stood whole. Fresh-cut logs. A wooden door slightly ajar. Light spilling through its windows. It shouldn't have been possible. Samira turned and ran, breath ragged, vision blurring with panic. But every direction she turned, she ended up back at the cabin, like the forest was folding in on itself. The door creaked open. She saw shadows inside. People, faces staring from the window, faces warped with pain and rage. Her voice cracked as she shouted for help, but the forest swallowed her scream. A heat wave rushed over her, blistering. She dropped to the ground. The last thing she saw was the door swinging wide, the fire inside roaring without flame, without fuel, and the figures within reaching out for her with hands blackened by smoke and time. Samira's body was found 2 days later by a group of hikers who had gotten lost in the woods. She was lying just outside the ring of ruins, half-conscious, dehydrated, and badly burned, though there had been no fire in the area. Her equipment was found inside her tent, which appeared untouched a few miles away. None of the footage on her memory cards remained. All files were corrupted, except one, a single still image. It showed the cabin hole, with a figure standing in the doorway. The timestamp indicated it was taken 2 hours after the hikers claimed to have found her. Samira never spoke publicly about what happened. She stopped writing, stopped filming, moved to a different state, changed her name. When pressed by a colleague years later, she said only this: "I wasn't the first to see it. I don't think I was supposed to leave. I think it let me go so I'd warn the next one." To this day, some hikers still report strange heat waves in ash grove forest. Others speak of seeing a cabin where no cabin should exist, always with the smell of smoke, always right before the fog rolls in. And sometimes, just as they turn back, they hear the voices, whispers trailing behind in the trees. Burn, burn, burn. The boy who never came down from the tree ****. There are places in the woods where the trees feel too close, with the branches above tangled together, like a web designed not to protect from the rain, but to trap something inside. One such place sits on the edge of Birch Hollow, a stretch of forgotten forest land near an old ranger outpost. The path leading in is barely visible, overtaken by roots and decay. Locals call it the mouth. They say the trees there are hungry, that they took a boy once, and he never came back down. The boy's name was Lucas Grant, 9 years old, quiet, loved climbing trees. He and his family were spending a weekend at a rented cabin nearby, a last-minute escape from city life. His parents weren't the outdoorsy type, but Lucas was fascinated by the forest. On the first day, he climbed everything in sight, rocks, fences, and eventually the towering pine behind the cabin. His parents warned him not to go too high. He just smiled and said, "The trees don't want to hurt me. They told me so." They thought he was playing. Imagination running wild. That night, Lucas didn't sleep. He kept looking out the window, whispering to something in the dark. When his mother asked who he was talking to, he simply replied, "My friend in the branches." His father chuckled nervously. "Maybe we've had enough woods for one day." The next morning, Lucas was gone. No sign of forced entry. No broken windows or disturbed locks. Just his shoes placed neatly by the front door and the back door slightly ajar, swaying in the breeze. His parents searched the surrounding area, calling his name until their voices were raw. When the rangers arrived, they began combing through the forest. Dogs caught his scent, but it always ended at the base of the largest pine in the area, a twisted, towering tree with black bark and sprawling limbs. There are no signs of struggle, no footprints climbing up, no snapped branches to indicate someone had climbed it. But something was off. The animals wouldn't go near it. The air around the tree felt still, thick, as if holding its breath. Then came the first report. One of the rangers, an older man named Curtis Bell, claimed to have seen a boy high in the branches. Not climbing, just there, standing on a thick limb 30 feet up, perfectly still. When he called out, the boy didn't move. Curtis climbed partway up, shouting for backup, but when he looked again, the branch was empty. More reports followed. Campers, hikers, even other rangers swore they saw a small figure perched in the trees of Birch Hollow, always at a distance, always watching. and always gone the moment they blinked or looked away. Lucas's parents stayed at the cabin for 3 more days, refusing to leave without him. On the final night, his mother heard something at the window, a soft tapping. She pulled back the curtain and saw her son standing outside barefoot, his clothes damp with morning dew. He smiled, then vanished into the dark. The family eventually left, broken and hollow. Lucas was declared missing, presumed dead, but the sightings never stopped. Years later, hikers started to whisper about the tree watcher. They spoke of a boy with pale skin and wide, hollow eyes peering down from the trees. Some claimed he followed them with his gaze as they walked the trail. Others said he whispered things when the wind picked up, fragments of children's songs or warnings like, "Don't go higher," or "It's too late for me." One group of campers found strange carvings on their tent when they woke up one morning. Scratches that read, "Come up, see what I see." A paranormal researcher named Dr. Elise Marlowe made the trek to Black Hollow 5 years after Lucas disappeared. She was skeptical, armed with motion sensors, trail cams, and thermal imaging equipment. She camped alone, determined to document what she called mass hallucination in an anxiety-prone biome. Her first night was quiet, nothing out of place. On the second night, her equipment malfunctioned. The batteries drained. Her compass spun wildly. Her radios picked up strange static laced with a child's laughter. She started seeing movement in the trees, the shape of a boy flitting from branch to branch, faster than any human could move. When she tried to film it, her camera shut off. When she climbed a low tree to try to get a better view, she found a message carved into the bark. "You can't come back down." She fled the forest that night. Her report was never published. She left her field entirely, vanishing from public life. One of her colleagues later found her in a care facility, unresponsive, drawing crude images of stick-figure children in trees. Every picture had one thing in common: the eyes, hollow, black, empty. Today, the path to Black Hollow is overgrown. Most people avoid it altogether, but occasionally, a daring traveler ignores the warnings. Some return, but not all, and those who do often come back change. They speak softly. They don't sleep near trees anymore. Some insist they still hear someone calling their name in the night, a child's voice, whispering, asking them to climb, to see what he sees, to join him in the branches forever. The woman who drowned in the roots ***. There's a part of the Evershade forest where the ground never dries. Even in the dead of summer, when the sun bakes the soil into cracked, dusty sheets across most of the region, this small, sunken glade remains soaked, as it remembers something it refuses to forget. Locals call it Deadwater Hollow, a name whispered more often as a warning than a destination. The forest floor there is soft, spongy, covered in moss, so thick it seems to breathe beneath your feet. Trees grow in unnatural angles, roots exposed like veins, twisting together to form bizarre patterns across the land. And in the center of it all lies a still, black pool. It's only about 10 feet wide, perfectly circular. No stream feeds it. No wildlife drinks from it. Birds fall silent overhead. The wind dies at its edge. And the water, deep, dark, unmoving, has never reflected the sky. Not once. It was into this forest that Lena Harrow stepped one cool October afternoon. A naturalist, a PhD student studying wetland ecosystems and their influence on fungal colonies. She had heard about the unusual biology of Deadwater Hollow through an old forum post. The idea of an isolated microclimate intrigued her. She wasn't superstitious. If anything, she was allergic to stories of curses and spirits. To her, every legend had a logical root in science, misunderstood behaviors, environmental oddities, fear. She set up camp near the edge of the hollow and began her analysis, collecting soil samples and documenting the twisted root systems. She noted something odd almost immediately. The trees, despite being alive, bore no fruit. No birds nested in their branches. No insects crawled across their trunks. And the moss seemed to grow in spirals, perfect concentric rings that made her skin crawl when viewed from above. Still, she pressed on. That night, as fog began to coil between the trees, Lena heard something outside her tent, a slow, wet sloshing sound. She opened the flap and looked out into the glade. Nothing moved, but the pool in the center, it had changed. The surface, once still, now rippled slightly, and rising from its center was a faint outline of something pale, flesh-like. It was gone in seconds. The next morning, she returned to the water with her equipment. She lowered a waterproof camera into the pool and watched her screen as it descended. The feed showed roots, thick and gnarled, reaching down like claws, and then something else, fabric, torn and swaying, a scrap of dress, pale blue, trapped among the roots, then skin, a face, not skeletal, not decomposed, intact, eyes open, staring. Lena dropped the controller in shock. She pulled the camera up, heart racing, only to find the feed had gone dark. The lens cracked, the cable shredded near the end, like it had been chewed. She considered leaving that very moment, but a strange compulsion rooted her in place. Something whispered in her ear, not aloud but from within, like the forest had moved into her thoughts. Stay. That evening, Lena pored through local records. She discovered that a woman had disappeared in the area nearly 40 years ago, Margaret Holloway, a teacher from a nearby town who came to the forest to paint its fall colors and never returned. Her body was never found. Some said she'd run off. Others whispered she had been taken by the glade, that the forest had chosen her. Lena returned to the pool at twilight, drawn by a pull she couldn't explain. She stood at the edge, watching the black surface, and suddenly she saw Margaret, not in the water, in the trees. A woman with long dark hair, wet and clinging to her face, stood between the twisted roots. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes locked on Lena's, wide and empty. She lifted one trembling hand and pointed downward. Lena turned to the water. It was bubbling now, churning. A low groan rose from beneath the surface, like the sound of an old door dragging across stone. Something was rising, something massive. Roots, dozens of them, crawling up from the water like the legs of a spider, thick and soaked and dripping. At their center, a shape emerged, a woman's face, wrapped in vines and decay, eyes open and mouth gasping. Margaret. The roots reached toward Lena, slow and deliberate. She stumbled back, screaming, and ran to the woods without her gear. She didn't stop until she reached her car miles away. Mud caked to her legs, the stench of rot clinging to her skin. She never went back, but something followed her. Days after her return, she found wet footprints in her apartment, root fragments on her bathroom floor, the sound of bubbling water when her pipes weren't in use, and dreams, always the same, of the forest, of the woman, of hands pulling her down into the dark. She tried to tell people, but no one believed her. Eventually, Lena disappeared, vanished from her apartment in the middle of the night. The door was locked from the inside. No sign of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Only one thing left behind. Her boots, soaked, coated in moss, and a note, handwritten on the back of a lab report, with only 5 words. The roots never let go. To this day, hikers report strange sights near Deadwater Hollow. A woman's reflection in the pool, wet footprints in the leaves, and the smell, earthy, decaying, sweet. Those who get too close say they feel something tug at their ankles, like the forest is thirsty. And it remembers. Voices beneath the leaves, asterisk, asterisk. There are places in the world where the earth seems to whisper, where the soil isn't just dirt, but something older, something that has memories of things long forgotten. The forest near the town of Hollow Ridge is one of those places. Nestled between craggy hills and tangled thickets, Hollow Ridge Forest is a place where shadows grow deep and long, even at noon, where the trees bend inward, their limbs knotted and twisted, as if trying to keep the secrets buried within the earth. The locals avoid it. They tell stories about it, stories that would keep anyone with a shred of common sense from venturing too far inside. But those who are drawn by the allure of mystery, or those who simply don't know any better, often don't come back the same. One such person was Jake Andrews, an ambitious journalist from the city. He had heard the rumors, Stories from hunters and hikers about strange, disembodied voices that floated through the forest. Whispers that seemed to rise from the leaves themselves. Words that crawled into the mind like insects. He had heard of people getting lost, only to find themselves back at the same spot over and over, as though the forest itself were shifting. But most troubling of all were the tales of those who had heard the voices. The ones who spoke about how they felt a terrible pull toward the woods, the sensation of being guided by something they couldn't understand, something that spoke their names when they weren't looking. Jake was skeptical. He wasn't someone who bought into superstition, especially not when there was a story to be told. Armed with camera and a notebook, he decided to take on the Hollow Ridge mystery, determined to uncover the truth. The woods, after all, were just woods, right? Trees, ground, animals. There was nothing sinister about them. But even Jake could not ignore the uneasy feeling that gnawed at him as he stood at the edge of the forest. The trees looming like silent sentinels, their shadows stretching across the forest floor like fingers. He entered the woods at midday, but the sun didn't seem to penetrate the canopy. The air was thick and still, like the forest was holding its breath. Birds didn't chirp. The wind didn't blow. It was as though the entire place was frozen in time. Jake brushed it off as just another eerie atmosphere. Nothing more. He began walking deeper, filming as he went, describing the trees, the silence, the peculiar way the forest seemed to close in around him. Hours passed. By late afternoon, the sun had begun to dip behind the hills, casting the forest in a strange, golden light. Jake found himself deep within the heart of Hollow Ridge, far beyond any trail. His footsteps were muffled in the thick layers of leaves and underbrush. That's when he first heard it. A voice. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him. But then it came again, clearer this time, a soft, low whisper just at the edge of hearing. His heart raced, and he stopped in his tracks, listening. Jake? It was his name. He spun around, but there was no one. His camera caught nothing but trees and shadows. He dismissed it as his imagination, fatigue starting to set in. But then it came again. Louder this time. Jake, you're not alone. His blood ran cold. He tried to rationalize it. It had to be some prank. Someone following him. Maybe it was a strange echo of the wind bouncing off the trees. But no matter how he tried to explain it, his gut told him something was wrong. The voice wasn't distant. It was close. Very close. He picked up his pace, trying to find his way out. But the forest seemed different. The trees felt taller, the shadows deeper. And the whispers, they were all around him now. Faint murmurs, like distant conversations, just out of reach. He couldn't make out the words, but they were constant. A chorus of voices, soft and unintelligible, rising from the forest floor itself. Jake quickened his steps. The whispers grew louder. Suddenly, he stopped dead in his tracks. The ground beneath him shifted. The leaves began to move, as if something was beneath them. He dropped to his knees, heart pounding, and pushed the leaves aside. Beneath them, the earth was damp, soft. He dug further, deeper, as if the earth itself was calling to him, urging him to uncover what lay hidden. His fingers brushed against something cold, something smooth, something unnatural. A hand, a skeletal hand, pale and decayed, protruding from the earth like a forgotten relic. He recoiled, heart hammering in his chest. He stumbled back, falling to the ground. The whispers escalated, turning into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. His name was shouted from every direction, like 1,000 voices trying to claw their way into his mind. Jake, 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 asterisk, asterisk. The ground began to shake beneath him. Terrified, Jake tried to stand, but something heavy, something alive, dragged him backward, pulling at his legs, tugging him toward the place where the hand had emerged. His breath came in frantic gasps, his heart thundering as he struggled. But the forest wouldn't let him go. The roots of the trees twisted like serpents, curling around his limbs, trapping him in place. The voices were everywhere now. They weren't just calling his name anymore. They were whispering in languages he didn't understand, speaking of things, horrible, ancient things. The leaves beneath him moved, not from the wind, but from something stirring beneath the surface. And then He saw them. Figures emerging from the earth. Pale, rotting faces, their eyes hollow and empty, their bodies wrapped in decay. They had been buried here, in this cursed forest, for so long that their flesh had melted away, leaving only bones and tattered remnants of clothing. Their hands reached for him, long and bony, dragging themselves toward the surface. Jake screamed, but the forest swallowed his voice. In the last moments before he lost consciousness, Jake realized what had been calling to him. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a prank. The voices were not echoes or hallucinations. The forest was alive, and it wanted him. The next morning, searchers found his camera abandoned on the forest floor. The footage was intact, showing nothing but shaking trees and blurred shapes. No sign of Jake, but the camera had recorded something else. At the very end of the footage, a single whisper could be heard, faint but clear, "Welcome." To this day, no one dares to venture too deep into Hollow Ridge. The forest remains unchanged, its secrets buried deep beneath the leaves. But the whispers continue, calling to anyone who dares to listen. The woman who walked through walls, ***. The town of Black Hollow had never been particularly known for anything remarkable until the disappearance of Emily Turner. The locals often joked that Black Hollow was stuck in time, a place where nothing ever seemed to change. The same houses stood at the edge of the forest. The same street lamps flickered in the evening. The same small shopkeeper, old Mr. Farrow, could be found polishing the same windows for decades. It was a sleepy town with a quiet history. But that was before Emily vanished. Emily Turner was the kind of woman who didn't belong in a place like Black Hollow. She was a city girl, born and raised in a bustling metropolitan area. She came to Black Hollow on a whim, deciding to take a break from her high-pressure job in the city, looking for solitude, peace, maybe even a little inspiration for her writing. She rented a small, quaint cottage on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods, perfect for escaping the noise of the outside world. The first few days, everything seemed normal. Emily loved the quiet, so much so that she decided to forego her phone and social media for a while, wanting to get away from the endless cycle of work and distraction. Her days were spent walking to the nearby woods, reading, and sitting in the cozy cottage by the fire. But it wasn't long before she began to notice strange things. It started with the mirrors. At first, it was subtle. The reflection in the living room mirror didn't always match the movement of the person standing in front of it. Emily laughed it off as a trick of the light, maybe even a result of an old, warped mirror. But when she caught her reflection blinking after she had already blinked, an exact copy of her movement, but delayed by a fraction of a second, the amusement quickly turned to unease. Then came the sounds. She'd be sitting on the couch, try to read, when she would hear something faint, a tapping, like fingers drumming against wood. It was soft, rhythmic, like someone was just out of sight, waiting. But when she checked, the house was always empty. Emily tried to dismiss it. It was just an old house. Old houses creak. But then, one evening, something happened that she couldn't explain away. She was sitting at the kitchen table, eating dinner, when she noticed the door to the basement slowly creak open. She hadn't opened it. No one else had. But there it was, standing wide open, the darkness below beckoning her. Her breath caught in her throat. A cold draft blew in from the basement, making the candlelight flicker. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky, unsure if she was speaking to the air or to whatever might be lurking in the dark. There was no answer, just silence. Then the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from a basement. Emily rushed to the door, her heart pounding. The stairs were steep and narrow, and the basement smelled of mildew and age. But as she looked down into the blackness, she saw something that froze her to the spot. A figure stood at the foot of the stairs, just out of reach of the light. It was a woman, tall, pale, with dark hair cascading down her back. She was wearing a long, tattered dress, like something from another era. Emily's heart raced. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet felt heavy, like the earth had suddenly glued her to the floor. The figure didn't move. She simply stared at Emily, her face expressionless, her eyes wide and unblinking. Suddenly, the woman stepped forward, but not down the stairs. She glided, floated, toward Emily, her movements unnatural, as if gravity had no hold on her. Emily stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet as the woman reached out with one hand. A chilling cold radiated from her touch, sending a wave of nausea through Emily's body. Before Emily could react, the figure vanished. Not like a person stepping out of the light. It was more like she had never been there at all. One moment, the basement was empty. The next, nothing remained but the dark. Emily bolted from the house, running into town as fast as she could, her mind spinning with fear and confusion. She didn't know what she had seen, but it had felt real, too real. The townspeople looked at her strangely when she explained what happened. Some laughed it off as nerves. Others muttered something about the house and its history. But Emily wasn't the type to back down. She returned to the cottage the very next day, determined to uncover the truth. What she discovered was far worse than she could have imagined. The house had once been owned by a woman named Margaret Hayes, a widow who had lived there alone for many years. Margaret had been known for her eccentricity and her tendency to speak to herself in the mirror. She had always claimed that the house was haunted, that the spirits of those who had died in the nearby woods had come to visit her, to speak to her. Margaret's obsession with the house had eventually driven her mad. One night, she disappeared without a trace. The only thing left behind was a note, written hastily in a frantic hand. The note read, "I hear them calling me. They want me to join them. They won't let me leave." Emily had the distinct feeling that Margaret had never truly left the house. But somehow, the house had kept her. She had become part of it, a shadow, a memory. That night, Emily decided to confront whatever force haunted the house. She stood before the mirror in the living room, the same mirror where she had first noticed the strange reflections. This time, she didn't blink. She didn't move. She stared into her own eyes, her breath slow and steady, trying to center herself. And then, just as she had feared, the reflection began to change. It wasn't her anymore. The woman in the mirror smiled, a twisted, sadistic smile, and began to reach out toward her. Emily backed away from the mirror, her pulse quickening, but the woman stepped out, her form spilling into the room like ink into water. Emily ran, but no matter how fast she moved, the woman was always a step behind, her cold fingers grazing Emily's skin. She felt herself weakening, the air thickening with dread, as the house seemed to grow taller, the walls shifting, becoming an endless maze of corridors. And then the woman's voice came, soft and low. "You can never leave." Emily screamed, but the house swallowed her sound. The next morning, when the neighbors came to check on her, they found the cottage empty. Not a trace of Emily was left behind, except for one thing: the mirror in the living room. It was cracked, the glass shattered in a way that looked like it had been clawed apart. The only thing visible in the mirror was a dark, empty hallway, and in the reflection, standing at the end of the hall, was Emily, her face pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. She was staring at something, or someone, just out of sight. And she wasn't alone. The woman who walked through walls had taken her. And now, Emily had become part of the house, part of the reflection, forever. The last door at the end of the world, asterisk, asterisk. In the small, crumbling town of Milstead, there was an old inn that locals referred to only in hushed whispers, the Birch Hollow Inn. It had once been a charming place for travelers to rest, but now it sat like a forgotten monument to a time long past. The paint had peeled off the walls, the windows were streaked with grime, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and dust. Most people avoided it. In fact, the town had all but forgotten about the inn, save for the old-timers who remembered it from when they were children. The inn was never officially closed. It just stopped being mentioned. People used to come and go through its doors, until one day they stopped. There was a rumor, of course. There always is in small towns. A story passed from generation to generation. The Birch Hollow Inn had a door. Not just any door, but a door at the end of a narrow, dimly lit hallway. A door that no one had ever entered and lived to speak of. For years, it had remained locked. But people swore they could hear it at night. The sound of someone on the other side, knocking, begging to be let out. When Jake Mason arrived in Milstead, he didn't know about the inn's history. He wasn't there for the ghost stories or the rumors. He was simply looking for a place to stay after a long day of hiking. He was a traveling photographer, visiting remote towns, capturing the forgotten beauty of places like Milstead. And when he walked past the Birch Hollow Inn, its crumbling facade caught his eye. It was hauntingly beautiful in a way that begged to be photographed. Curious, he entered. The bell above the door chimed eerily as he stepped inside. The smell of decay and dust filled the air. The lobby was empty, save for the faint hum of an old ceiling fan that barely moved. A dusty desk sat at the far end, and behind it, a door marked Employees Only. Jake didn't see anyone, so he called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" At first, there was silence. Then a voice, soft, far off, as if coming from a great distance. "Welcome. We've been waiting." Jake froze, unsure if he had heard it correctly. He glanced around, but the lobby remained still. He shrugged it off, assuming it was just the wind playing tricks on him. After a moment, the door behind the desk creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with a hunched back and deep, tired eyes. She wore a faded floral dress, and her silver hair hung loosely around her shoulders. She gave him a small smile, though it was hard to tell whether it was friendly or forced. "You're looking for a room, I take it?" she asked in a voice that seemed almost rehearsed. Yes, just for the night," Jake replied, trying to shake off the unease that was beginning to settle in his chest. He hadn't expected to be greeted by someone, let alone someone so strange. "Of course," the woman said, her voice carrying an almost hypnotic quality. "Come right this way." She led him down the hall toward the stairs, where the air seemed colder. The board beneath their feet creaked with every step. As they walked, Jake couldn't help but notice the long, dark hallway stretching before him, lined with closed doors, each one sealed tight. But at the end of the hall, there was a door that caught his attention. It was different from the rest. Taller, darker, a shadow seemed to hang around it. Even though there were no windows nearby, there was something about it that felt off, wrong. Jake felt a strange pull, as if something was beckoning him toward it. His heart began to race, and for a moment, he wanted to ask about the door. But something in the woman's gaze, something that made his skin crawl, stopped him. She turned to him, her eyes sharp despite her age. "Don't go near that door," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. Jake nodded, but the pull was too strong. As he settled into his room later that evening, he found his thoughts drifting back to the door at the end of the hall. He had to know what was behind it. He had to see it. In the dead of night, when the inn was silent except for the occasional creak of the old wood, Jake quietly left his room. His footsteps echoed softly down the hallway, each step making him more nervous, but also more curious. When he reached the end of the hall, his breath caught in his throat. The door was ajar. He hadn't heard it open. There had been no sound. It just was the soft, inviting darkness beyond it seemed to pull at him, urging him to step through. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning as if protesting the intrusion. Inside, the room was unlike any he had seen in the inn. It wasn't dusty, wasn't abandoned. It was pristine, untouched, and everything inside seemed too perfect. A large bed, rich red curtains hanging from the windows, old furniture polished to a mirror shine. But what caught his attention was the center of the room. There, in the middle of the floor, was a single chair, and sitting in the chair was a man. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly ahead, his face pale and lifeless. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, the fabric worn but still intact. The man was utterly still. As Jake stepped closer, he realized the man wasn't breathing. And then, just as he was about to back away, the man's eyes shifted. They locked onto Jake, and a cold, hollow voice filled the room. "It's your turn." Jake stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. But before he could react, the door slammed shut behind him. Darkness enveloped him. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The next morning, when the innkeeper came to check on Jake, the room was empty. The bed was made. His belongings were gone. There was no sign of the man who had been there the night before, or of Jake himself. And the door at the end of the hall, it was locked again. For years, people would occasionally come to the inn, only to vanish without a trace. Some left before they even made it through the door, but the inn still stood, silent and waiting. As for the last door at the end of the world, it remained open for whoever would come next. The ghosts in the walls. There was a place just outside of Camden, a crumbling old mansion perched on a cliff's edge, overlooking the churning sea below. The locals called it Blackthorn Manor. It had stood there for over a century, a ghostly silhouette against a backdrop of ever-gray skies and relentless waves. It had once been a grand estate, a place of beauty and laughter, but now it was a ruin, a monument to the past and to the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. The story of Blackthorn Manor began with the Williamson family. They were wealthy, powerful, and well-respected in the community. But the mansion was never just a home. It was a symbol of something darker. The father, Thomas Williamson, was an eccentric and brilliant inventor who grew obsessed with his work. He was convinced that the key to immortality lay hidden in the walls of his house, and that his family would be the perfect subjects for his experiments. For years, the family lived in isolation, cut off from the rest of the world. Neighbors rarely saw them, and when they did, they spoke of an air of unease around the manor. Strange sounds came from the house at night. Screams, whispers, the clatter of metal and glass. But no one dared approach. Thomas Williamson's wealth and influence kept the town at bay, and so the house stood undisturbed, save for the rumors that swirled around it. But one fateful night, everything changed. Thomas Williamson disappeared. No one knew exactly what happened to him, but his wife, Evelyn, was found dead in the drawing room, her face contorted in terror. The children, 2 sons, Samuel and Henry, vanished without a trace. No one could explain it, not even the local authorities. It was as if the house itself had consumed them. And from that moment on, Blackthorn Manor became something else entirely. It became a place of death. For years, the manor sat abandoned, its doors bolted shut, its windows covered in dust. But the stories didn't end. No, they only grew darker. People claimed to hear strange noises late at night, footsteps echoing through the empty halls, whispers rising from the walls themselves. Some said they saw figures in windows, their faces distorted and twisted with pain. And so, the mansion fell into legend. It was a place to be feared, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead had long been erased. It wasn't until years later that someone dared enter Blackthorn Manor again. His name was Daniel Carter, a paranormal investigator with a reputation for seeking out the most haunted places in the world. He had heard the stories about Blackthorn Manor and had been intrigued. A place where the very walls were said to hold the spirits of the dead? He couldn't resist. When Daniel arrived in Camden, he went straight to the manor. The locals, as usual, warned him to stay away, but Daniel was undeterred. He was a man of logic and reason, someone who didn't believe in ghosts or spirits. The stories, he assumed, were just tales created by an overactive imagination. The first time he stood in front of the manor, he was struck by its sheer size. It loomed before him, dark and imposing, the windows like hollow eyes staring down at him. The wind howled around the house, making the trees sway in eerie patterns. The air was thick with the smell of salt and decay, and something about the place made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. But Daniel was determined to go inside. The front door creaked open with ease, and the moment he stepped into the foyer, he felt the temperature drop. It wasn't a simple chill. It was an unnatural cold, one that seemed to seep into his bones. The air was heavy with the weight of something old, something that had been trapped in the house for far too long. Daniel set up his equipment in the main hall, including cameras, motion sensors, and voice recorders. He had come to capture evidence of the paranormal, and he wasn't leaving until he had it. As he moved through the house, he could hear the creaking of floorboards beneath his feet, the whispering of the wind as it passed through cracks in the walls. But there was something else, something that felt wrong. He felt it first in the library, where the air was thick and oppressive. The shelves, once filled with books, were now empty, save for a few tattered volumes that had long since been abandoned. As he walked between the rows of shelves, he heard a soft sound, a scratching, like fingernails scraping against wood. He spun around, his flashlight flickering, but there was nothing there. Then he heard it, a voice, faint at first, but growing louder until it was a whisper in his ear. "Get out." He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The voice was so clear, so real, that he almost turned and ran. But instead, he pressed on, trying to rationalize it. He was in an old house. Old houses creaked. Old houses made noises. But then he heard it again. "Get out." This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a command, cold and commanding. And it was coming from the walls. Daniel's heart began to race. He moved quickly through the mansion, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty rooms. But as he walked, the voices grew louder. There were multiple voices now, some pleading, some angry, all calling out from the walls. "Help us. Please don't leave. Don't let them take you." And then a scream, a horrific, guttural scream that shook the very foundation of the house. Daniel turned and ran, his breath ragged, the walls pressing in around him. The door to the main hall was just ahead, but as he approached it, the air grew thick with an unbearable pressure. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping him inside. The voices were all around him now, whispering, screaming, pleading. They weren't just in the walls. They were in his head. They were inside him, filling his mind with visions of the past, of Thomas Williamson and his twisted experiments, of Evelyn's final moments, of the children screaming for mercy as they were consumed by the house. "Please," he whispered, "let me out." The walls began to close in. The air grew colder. The whispers became louder. And then a shadow appeared at the end of the hall. It was a figure, a man, dressed in a long coat, his face hidden in shadow. "Don't run," the figure said, his voice low and distorted. "You're part of us now." The last thing Daniel saw before everything went black was the figure's outstretched hand, reaching for him. The next morning, the mansion was quiet again. The doors were closed. The windows were shuttered. And in the walls, the voices were still there, waiting for the next soul to wander into their grasp. No one knew what had happened to Daniel Carter. The locals still tell stories about Blackthorn Manor, but the mansion is no longer a place for curious explorers. It's a place where the dead linger, trapped in the walls, their voices whispering to anyone foolish enough to listen. The watchers in the dark. The town of Ravensbrück had always been quiet, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. The streets were neat and well-maintained. The people were friendly but reserved, and the sky above always seemed to be a uniform shade of gray. But there was one thing about Ravensbrück that made it different from all the other sleepy towns dotted across the countryside. The people there never left after dark. In the heart of the town stood a tall, looming building, an ancient church that had been around for hundreds of years. The church was large and imposing, with spires that reached high into the sky, its windows dark and somber, never allowing the light to filter through. The bell tower, which rang every hour without fail, was an eerie reminder of the past. Despite the passage of time, the church had never been renovated, never been modernized. It remained as it had always been, a place that seemed to guard the secrets of the town. For most of Ravensbrück's residents, the church was a place of comfort, a beacon in the center of their small community. But for a select few, the church had always been something else entirely. The older generation spoke of strange happenings, of whispers that floated through the air during the night, of shadows moving behind the stained glass windows, of footsteps echoing down the empty halls when no one was there. And then there was the town's most peculiar rule. No one ever went out after dark. The town would lock its doors, shutter its windows, and gather inside. The reason for this unspoken law had long been forgotten by most of the town, but the elders knew the truth. Something old and ancient watched them from the darkness. One rainy evening, a man named Gregory Blake came to Ravensbrück. He was an outsider, a historian from the city researching small towns with oddities and dark histories. Ravensbrück caught his attention because, in all his years of research, he had never encountered a place with such a strict curfew. Intrigued, he decided to visit. He arrived in the afternoon, just as the sky darkened with clouds. The town seemed peaceful enough. He was greeted with polite smiles from the townsfolk, who were all too happy to chat about their quaint little community. But Gregory couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He was invited to the inn by an elderly woman, Mrs. Lambert, who gave him a key to a room on the second floor. As he unpacked, he noticed the peculiarities of the inn. The curtains were drawn tight, the windows were locked shut, and the heavy silence in the air felt almost suffocating. As evening descended, Mrs. Lambert offered him a meal in the small dining room. The food was simple but filling, and the atmosphere was calm. But as the night wore on, he began to feel an increasing sense of unease. He was the only one left in the dining room, the other patrons having disappeared long before. Mrs. Lambert approached him, her face solemn. "It's nearly time," she said in a low voice. "You should return to your room, Mr. Blake." "Return to my room?" Gregory asked, confused. "Why? The night is still young." "You'll understand soon enough," she replied cryptically. "Please don't ignore the rules." Gregory, a man who prided himself on his skepticism, thought it all sounded like superstition. "Thank you for the meal, Mrs. Lambert, but I'll be staying out for a while longer. I'm not afraid of a little darkness." The woman's eyes softened with a kind of sad pity. "It's not the darkness you should fear, Mr. Blake. It's what's watching from it." Gregory laughed at her warnings, brushing them off as the ramblings of an old woman. He left the dining room, stepping into the narrow hallway of the inn. The clock struck 8 as he made his way toward the door. The street outside was nearly empty, save for the faint glow of a single lantern hanging by the church's entrance. It was cold, the wind picking up, and there was an unsettling stillness in the air. But Gregory was determined to get some answers. He walked to the church, his footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The door to the church was open, and the bell tower loomed high above, casting a long shadow across the town. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old beams above. Gregory took out his notebook and began to scribble down observations about the church's architecture, its age, and its oddities. But as he walked further inside, he felt it, the unmistakable sensation that he wasn't alone. He turned around, but the church was still empty. No one was there. Yet the feeling persisted, the sensation of being watched. He heard a faint noise, like a breath being drawn just behind him. He spun around, but again no one was there. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly, but his words seemed to vanish into silence. Then a whisper came, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Leave." Gregory's heart pounded. He took a few steps backward, unsure what he was hearing. The whisper came again, this time louder, more distinct. "Leave now. You're not supposed to be here." He looked around frantically, his mind racing. The whispering was coming from the walls. From every corner of the church, soft voices seemed to call out to him, their words unintelligible, yet full of malice. Suddenly, the door to the church slammed shut, and the air grew cold. Gregory rushed to the door, tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers were growing louder now, a cacophony of voices, all rising together in a desperate, frenzied plea. "Leave. Get out. Get out now." And then something moved in the dark. Shadows shifted across the walls, twisted and long, their shapes inhuman and grotesque. Gregory turned, his eyes widening in terror, as figures began to emerge from the shadows. They were tall, gaunt figures, their features obscured by darkness. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, like reflections of the moonlight. They didn't move like people. They seemed to glide, floating just above the ground. The figures closing on him, their eyes never leaving his. Gregory felt a cold, paralyzing fear grip him. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He couldn't breathe. It was as if the air had thickened, pressing down on him, suffocating him. The figures were now mere feet away from him, their eyes burning with an unholy intensity. And then one of them spoke. "You shouldn't have stayed." Gregory's body froze as a wave of dread washed over him. He couldn't scream. He couldn't move. He could only watch as the figures slowly advanced, their voices growing louder. And then everything went black. When the townspeople came to the church the next morning, they found it empty. The doors had been locked from the inside, and the windows were covered in a thick layer of frost. No sign of Gregory Blake remained, except for a note found in the center of the church. It was scribbled hastily, the handwriting erratic, barely legible. They're always watching. Always. And they don't let you leave. From that day on, the people of Ravensbrück no longer ignored the town's rules. The town stayed locked down after dark, and the watchers in the dark remained silent, waiting for the next person who dared to break the unspoken law. The voices beneath the floorboards. There are places where silence feels unnatural, where every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind, seems to carry a hidden message. In the small town of Greyhaven, nestled deep in the hills, one such place existed. It was a house at the end of Hawthorne Lane, an old Victorian home that had been abandoned for decades. Its windows were covered in dust, and ivy had grown thick around the exterior, its tendrils reaching up like hands, trying to pull the house into the earth. Most people in Greyhaven avoided the house. They said it was cursed, that it had been abandoned for a reason. But one man, Mark Jenkins, didn't believe in curses. He didn't believe in ghosts or spirits or anything that couldn't be explained by logic. So when he inherited the house from a distant relative, he saw it as nothing more than a fixer-upper, something he could renovate and turn into a place to escape the noise of the city. The house was beautiful in its own way, despite the neglect it had suffered over the years. The woodwork was intricate, the rooms spacious, and the ceilings high. But as Mark moved through the rooms, something about the house unsettled him. It wasn't the peeling wallpaper or the dust-covered furniture. It wasn't even the fact that the house had been empty for so long. It was the feeling that he was being watched. He didn't let it bother him at first. He was just here to work. After all, he spent his days tearing down old walls, scraping away the layers of decay that had settled over the house. But as night fell, the feeling became harder to ignore. It was a presence, something intangible, something that lurked in the corners of his vision, just out of reach. Sometimes, as he worked late into the evening, he could hear faint noises, scratching sounds from beneath the floorboards. At first, he thought it was just the house settling. Old houses creaked, right? But the noises grew louder, more deliberate. They came in patterns, as if something was trying to communicate with him. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable once you started paying attention. It was on the third night, after Mark had finished working for the day, that the noises took on a new form. He was sitting in the living room, flipping through some old blueprints of the house, when he heard a distinct sound, a voice. It was faint at first, a whisper just below the surface of his hearing. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice was coming from beneath the floorboards. It was so quiet that he thought he might be imagining it, but then the voice came again, louder this time. "Help me?" Mark stood up, his legs weak beneath him. He had heard it, without a doubt. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was a voice. Someone was trapped. He knelt down to the floor, pressing his ear against the wood. The voice came again, clearer now. "Please, help me. I'm under here." His pulse quickened, and he scrambled to find a tool to pry up the floorboards. His fingers fumbled as he pulled up a section of the old wood, his mind racing. What was he going to find? Who was down there? The floorboards gave way with a loud crack, and Mark's hands trembled as he peered into the dark space beneath. It was a small crawl space, barely big enough for a person to move through. The air was musty, thick with the scent of earth and rot. But as Mark shone his flashlight into the darkness, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A pair of eyes. They were wide, unblinking, and stared directly at him from the depths of the crawl space. Mark stumbled backward. His breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. The eyes didn't blink. They didn't seem to breathe. They just stared at him, empty and hollow, like they were waiting. And then the voice came again. "I'm trapped. You have to get me out." Mark shook his head, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There was no one down there. It was impossible. Yet the voice, clear, desperate, continued to plead with him. He grabbed the nearest object, a crowbar, and began prying at the floorboards with renewed determination. His heart raced as he chipped away at the wood, revealing more of the crawl space beneath. The flashlight flickered, casting long shadows against the walls of the house. And then, as if by some cruel trick of fate, the beam of light landed on something else. A hand, pale, cold, and skeletal, its fingers curled upward, reaching toward him from the darkness beneath the floor. Mark recoiled, his mind spinning with fear. But then the hand moved, slowly, purposefully. And the voice came again, clearer now, almost frantic. Please, please don't leave me here. Help me? Mark's chest tightened as he scrambled away from the opening, his legs weak, his breath shallow. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him whole was a hand, the fingers twitching, inching ever closer to him. He ran. He didn't stop until he was back in his car, driving away from the house, his mind reeling with the horrific images of the hand, the eyes, the voice. He tried to convince himself it was a trick of his imagination, that the house had simply gotten to him after days of working in isolation. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was down there, waiting, something that had been trapped for far too long. The next morning, Mark returned to the house with a team of workers. They were going to fix the floorboards, clear the debris, and continue his renovations. But when they arrived, they found something strange. The floorboards were perfectly intact. There was no sign of any disturbance. The crawl space beneath the house was completely sealed. No opening, no way to get in. The workers looked at Mark with confusion, but he knew what he had seen. The voice, the hand, it had all been real. But whatever was trapped beneath the floorboards had been waiting for something, waiting for him. Mark never returned to the house on Hawthorne Lane. The town of Greyhaven continued to thrive, and the house remained, as it always had, silent and watchful. The workers who had helped Mark with the renovations never spoke of what they had seen, but they, too, avoided the house in the years that followed. And to this day, the people of Greyhaven speak in hushed tones about the voices beneath the floorboards. No one knows who or what was calling out from beneath that house, but the whispers still linger in the town, warning anyone who might listen. Some things are better left buried.